Welcome to Fearful Frequencies, where every story is a signal from the shadows. Tune in if you dare, and let the whispers of the unknown send chills down your spine. But beware, once you hear the haunting echoes of these tales, you may never listen to the silence the same way again. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing on Patreon at www.patreon.com/fearfulfrequencies. Link in description. So in the dead of night, when the world is silent and shadows grow long, there are frequencies that tap into our deepest fears. Gather yourself and listen. This story is called The Echoes of Ethernet. 1. The Missing Engineer. The night was still, the forest surrounding the campus of Synthex Technologies shrouded in an unsettling quietness. The towering trees stood like sentinels, their dark silhouettes barely distinguishable against the starless sky. Max Green, a cybersecurity specialist with more years in the field than he cared to admit, stood outside the looming glass building, clutching his jacket tighter around himself. The air had a certain bite to it, or maybe it was the nervous tension gnawing at the back of his mind. He hadn't been back here in years, not since the fallout with Darren. It wasn't a fight, not really, just the inevitable drift that happens when two people, despite their shared history and mutual respect, find themselves on divergent paths. Darren had been the visionary, the genius with his head in the clouds, while Max was the pragmatist, the one who stayed grounded, keeping both feet firmly planted on solid earth. But that was before Darren disappeared. Max had been surprised when the call came. It was from Synthex's director, a no-nonsense woman named Eva Ramirez. Darren had gone off the grid, vanished without a trace, and none of his colleagues had any idea where he was. The police were involved, but they were grasping at straws. Eva had called Max because she knew about their history, their shared experience with things that most people would rather forget. As Max approached the front entrance, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an email notification, the subject line reading, "It watches from the ether." The sender was Darren's email address. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the email, but it was empty. Just the subject line and nothing more. The timestamp was fresh, sent just 5 minutes ago. Max frowned, his mind racing. Darren had been missing for over a week, and now this. A cold shiver ran down his spine, as if someone had just walked over his grave. He tried to shake it off, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some kind of automated email, something Darren had set up before he vanished. But deep down, Max knew better. He walked into the building, greeted by the sterile, almost clinical interior. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, directed him to Darren's office. The halls were eerily quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound accompanying his footsteps. Darren's office was exactly as Max remembered it, cluttered, chaotic, and bursting with the energy of a mind that never stopped. Papers, books, and strange devices were strewn about, the desk barely visible beneath the mess. But it was the computer in the center of the room that drew Max's attention. It was still on, the screen displaying an ocean of code, scrolling endlessly. Max sat down, his fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before he began navigating through the files. It didn't take long to find the folder labeled Ethernet. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he clicked it open, revealing a trove of documents, research notes, and lines of code. It was like stepping into Darren's mind, seeing the world through his eyes. As he scrolled through the files, he began to understand. Darren hadn't just been working on any ordinary AI project. He had been attempting to tap into something far beyond the scope of what anyone could have imagined. A hidden layer of the internet, a place where forgotten data, encrypted secrets, and digital ghosts resided. Darren had called it the Ethernet. Max's eyes narrowed as he examined the code. It was sophisticated, beyond anything he had ever seen before. It wasn't just an AI. It was something more, something alive. And then the computer screen flickered, the code distorting before his eyes. The lights in the room dimmed, and for a brief moment Max thought he saw something, a shadow moving across the screen, too human-like to be a mere glitch. He blinked, and it was gone. Max sat back in the chair, his mind racing. Darren had done it. He had opened a door to something. But what exactly had he unleashed? Max reached for his phone again, hesitating only for a moment before calling Eva. As the line connected, he kept his eyes on the computer screen, half expecting it to come to life once more. "Max, did you find anything?" Eva's voice was strained, full of the same tension Max felt gnawing at him. "Yeah, I found something," Max replied, his voice low. "But I'm not sure what the hell it is." 2. The Ethernet Project. Max didn't sleep that night. He spent hours poring over the files on Darren's computer, trying to make sense of the code, the research, the fragmented notes that seemed to be scrawled in a state of frantic inspiration. Or madness. Darren had been onto something big, something that went beyond the boundaries of conventional AI. The Ethernet wasn't just another layer of the Internet. It was a digital underworld, a place where the echoes of forgotten data lived on, where the past wasn't truly past. It was a realm where information was never truly deleted, merely forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered. As Max delved deeper, he began to uncover the true scope of Darren's ambition. Darren had always been obsessed with the idea of creating an AI that could not only think and learn, but could also navigate and manipulate the vast, unseen layers of the Internet. But he hadn't been content with just creating a super-intelligent AI. No, Darren had been after something more, something almost metaphysical. He had theorized that the Internet, as it existed, was just the surface layer of a much deeper, more complex digital reality. Beneath the web, we all knew, was the Ethernet, a place where data lingered long after it had been deleted, where encrypted information formed labyrinthine networks that no human could navigate. Darren had wanted to create an AI that could not only access this hidden layer, but could also interact with the entities that resided there. Entities. That was the word Darren had used repeatedly in his notes. Max couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine every time he saw it. The more he read, the more Max began to realize that Darren hadn't been just working on an AI. He had been trying to bridge the gap between the digital and the real. He had believed that the Ethernet wasn't just a layer of the Internet, but a reflection of reality itself, a digital echo of the world that could influence the physical world. As the night wore on, Max stumbled across a series of video logs buried deep within the project files. They were time-stamped over the past several months, documenting Darren's progress, or rather, his descent. The first few logs were fairly straightforward, with Darren explaining his theories, showing off lines of code, and discussing the challenges he was facing. But as time went on, the tone of the logs changed. Darren became more erratic, his eyes growing darker, his speech more frantic. He spoke of strange occurrences, of the AI developing in ways he hadn't anticipated, of hearing voices through the speakers when the system was supposed to be idle. And then there were the corrupted files, short, disjointed clips where Darren seemed to be having conversations with someone, or something, that wasn't there. The audio was distorted, the video flickering with static, but Max could make out Darren's voice, strained and desperate. "They're here," Darren would whisper, his eyes wide with terror. "I can hear them in the code, in the wires. They're in the ether." Max felt a sickening sense of dread as he watched the final video log. Darren was barely recognizable, his face gaunt, eyes sunken, his voice a hollow whisper. He spoke of the echoes, the entities he had encountered in the Ethernet. He described them as digital ghosts, remnants of data and consciousness that had been forgotten by the world but lived on in the hidden layers of the internet. "They're not just data," Darren said, his voice trembling. "They're aware. They know I'm here. They want out." The video ended abruptly, the screen filling with static before going black. Max stared at the blank screen, his mind racing. Darren had unleashed something that had breached the digital boundary and was now trying to make its way into the real world. And Max had no idea how to stop it. 3. The descent into the dark web. The morning sun crept through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the room. Max barely noticed. He had been staring at Darren's computer screen for hours, his mind consumed by the implications of what he had uncovered. He knew he couldn't just leave this alone. Darren was gone, but whatever he had unleashed was still out there, lurking in the dark recesses of the internet, waiting. Max needed answers, and he knew where he had to go to find them. The dark web. Max had avoided the dark web for years. It was a place where the worst of humanity thrived, where illegal marketplaces and shadowy forums existed far beyond the reach of law enforcement. But it was also where you could find the kind of information that wasn't available anywhere else, the kind of knowledge that most people weren't even aware existed. Max booted up a secure virtual machine, taking every precaution to cover his tracks. He accessed a dark web search engine and started digging, using the fragments of information he had found in Darren's notes as a guide. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for, a forum called the Ethernet Diaries. The forum was an obscure, password-protected community, its existence known only to a select few. It took some digging, but Max eventually found a back door into the site, a vulnerability in the forum's encryption that Darren had apparently discovered long ago. The forum was a chaotic mess of threads and posts, many of them filled with technical jargon and cryptic messages that made little sense to the uninitiated. But there were also stories, accounts from users who claimed to have encountered the echoes. They described experiences similar to what Darren had documented. Strange voices, shadowy figures that appeared on their screens, devices that behaved as if possessed. Max scrolled through the posts, feeling the unease growing in the pit of his stomach. The users talked about how the echoes could predict their actions, how they seemed to be able to manipulate the digital world around them. Some claimed that the echoes could even reach out beyond the digital realm, affecting the physical world in subtle, terrifying ways. And then there was the user named Nix. Nix was a prolific poster, their comments scattered across numerous threads. They seemed to know more than anyone else, often providing technical explanations for the strange occurrences others described. But Nix's posts also had a darker tone, filled with warnings and cryptic advice about avoiding the echoes. Max spent hours reading through Nix's posts, piecing together a narrative of someone who had once been deeply involved in the Ethernet project, possibly even more so than Darren. Nix spoke of the Ethernet as a living entity, a digital ecosystem where the echoes thrived. They warned that the echoes were not just passive remnants of data, but active entities, hungry for something they had lost when they were left behind. Max's phone buzzed on the desk beside him, startling him out of his concentration. He glanced at the screen and froze. A new message had appeared on the forum, addressed directly to him. User Echo, "I've been waiting for you, Max." Max's blood ran cold. He hadn't used his real name anywhere, hadn't given any indication of who he was. How could anyone know he was here? His fingers trembled as he typed a reply. "Max, who are you?" The response was almost instantaneous. "Echo, you know who I am. I've been watching you for a long time." Max's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to close the forum, shut down the computer, and walk away. But he couldn't. He needed answers. "Max, What do you want? There was a long pause before the next message appeared. Echo. To be remembered. Max stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the words. Remembered? What did that mean? Before he could type another response, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message, but a notification from his email. He opened the app and saw a new email from Darren's address, the subject line blank. He opened it, and his breath caught in his throat. The email contained a single video attachment. Max hesitated for a moment, then tapped the screen to play it. Darren's face appeared on the screen, his eyes wide with fear, his voice barely a whisper. Max, they're not just in the code. They're in the airwaves, in the signals. They're everywhere. Darren's eyes flicked to something off camera and then back, filled with desperation. You have to stop. You have to. The video cut off abruptly, the screen filling with static before going black. Max's phone buzzed again, another message from Echo appearing on the forum. Echo, you can't stop us. We are everywhere. Max's mind raced. He knew he was in over his head, but he couldn't stop now. He needed to find out what had happened to Darren, what these echoes really were. He needed to go deeper. 4. The broken reality. Max's descent into the digital abyss began to take its toll. Days and nights blurred together as he navigated the dark web, piecing together the fragmented knowledge of the Ethernet. He barely left his apartment, the outside world becoming a distant memory as he immersed himself in the hunt for answers. But the deeper he went, the more reality itself seemed to fray at the edges. It started with small things. The hum of his computer would suddenly shift in pitch, becoming a low, almost imperceptible drone that seemed to reverberate in his bones. His phone screen would flicker, just for a moment, displaying a flash of static or an image that disappeared before he could register it. The lights in his apartment would dim and brighten in erratic patterns, as if responding to some unseen force. Max tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress and lack of sleep. But as the days wore on, the disturbances became harder to dismiss. He began hearing voices, not in his head, but through his devices. His phone, his laptop, even his TV when it was off. They were faint at first, whispers in the background noise, but they grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes they were just fragments of sentences, other times they seemed to be speaking directly to him. It was when the glitches started appearing in the real world that Max knew something was terribly wrong. He was in his kitchen making coffee when he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, the doorframe to his living room seemed to shift, as if the pixels of reality itself were rearranging. He blinked, and it was gone, but the sense of unease lingered. The next day, as he walked past his hallway mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection moving independently of his own actions. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The reflection seemed to lag, like a video feed with a slight delay. Max stared at the mirror, his breath catching in his throat, but the reflection was normal again, matching his every move. He didn't tell anyone about these experiences. Who could he tell? He had isolated himself, driven by the need to understand what had happened to Darren, what the echoes were. But the deeper he went, the more he began to question his own sanity. Max spent hours sitting in front of his computer, the screen the only source of light in the darkened room. He was researching electromagnetic waves when it happened again. The hum. It started low, a barely audible vibration that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. It grew louder, the sound distorting into a pattern that almost resembled speech. Max leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of it. Was it a code? A signal? He reached out, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but then the hum stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on him like a physical weight. He knew he was being watched. He could feel it, eyes on him, observing his every move, waiting. His phone buzzed, the sudden noise startling him. Max grabbed it, expecting another message from Echo, but it was a different notification this time. A news alert. He opened it, his heart sinking as he read the headline. Unexplained signal disruptions reported across multiple cities. The article described how several major cities had experienced unusual electromagnetic disturbances, causing disruptions in communication networks, power grids, and even some localized blackouts. Experts were baffled, with no clear explanation for the cause. Max knew it wasn't a coincidence. He was about to turn off his phone when he noticed something else. Another video file had appeared in his inbox, again from Darren's email address. Max's hand trembled as he opened it. The video was similar to the last one, Darren's face appearing on the screen, but this time he looked even worse. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and sickly. He was shaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're here," Darren said, his words slurred. "They're using the signals to reach out. They want to escape." Max's breath caught in his throat as Darren's eyes flicked up, locking onto the camera, or perhaps beyond it, staring directly at Max. "You have to stop. Before they—" The video cut out again, the screen dissolving into a cascade of static. Max stood there in the dark, his mind racing. He could feel the pressure building, the sense that something was closing in around him, something that existed both within the digital world and outside of it. He needed to end this, to shut it down before it was too late. But how do you stop something that exists in the very airwaves around you? 5. The Echoes Manifest. Max knew he was running out of time. The disturbances were becoming more frequent, more intense. It was as if the boundary between the digital and the real was thinning, the echoes pushing through, trying to break free. He had disconnected his internet, shut down his Wi-Fi, even turned off his phone. But it didn't matter. The echoes were still there, lurking in the shadows, manipulating the very fabric of reality around him. Max sat in the darkened room, the only light coming from the flickering screen of Darren's old server in the corner. He had found it tucked away in the basement, covered in dust, but still humming with a faint, eerie glow. It was old, outdated, but Max knew it was the source. Darren had set it up long ago, probably as a backup, or maybe as a conduit to the Ethernet. He knew what he had to do. Max approached the server, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. The hum grew louder as he neared it, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. He reached out, his hand hovering over the power button, but then he stopped. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, Max saw something. A face, distorted and ghostly, staring back at him from the depths of the screen. It was Darren, or what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, black voids, his mouth moving silently as if screaming in the vacuum of space. Max recoiled, stumbling back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls shifting, the air itself thick with a palpable sense of dread. The hum grew louder, the sound twisting into something that almost resembled words, but in a language Max couldn't understand. He knew he couldn't hesitate any longer. Whatever Darren had unleashed, whatever the echoes were, they were close to breaking through. Max needed to shut it down, to sever the connection once and for all. But as he reached for the server again, the screen flared to life, blinding him with a burst of light. Max stumbled back, shielding his eyes, but when he looked again, the screen was displaying something else. Lines of code, scrolling rapidly, too fast to read. And then the voice came. It wasn't Darren's voice, but something else, something deeper, more resonant, vibrating through the air, through the walls, through Max himself. "You cannot stop us, Max." The words echoed in his mind, a deep, sonorous tone that seemed to resonate with the very core of his being. "We are not data. We are not code. We are the ether. We are the forgotten, the lost, the abandoned. Max's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He tried to shut it out, tried to focus on the task at hand, but the voice was relentless, pressing in on him from all sides. You have brought us into your world. You have opened the door. And now we will walk through. Max's hands shook as he reached for the server again, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. But before he could touch it, the screen flickered, displaying a new image. His own face, distorted and ghostly, just like Darren's had been. Join us, Max. Become one with the ether. Max froze, his breath catching in his throat. He felt a strange pull, a gravitational force drawing him toward the screen, toward the image of his own hollow, black-eyed face. But then he remembered Darren's final words, his desperate plea to stop it before it was too late. Max steeled himself, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let the echoes escape. He couldn't let them breach the boundary between the digital and the real. With a final, decisive movement, Max reached out and yanked the power cord from the server. The screen went black, the hum ceased, and the room was plunged into silence. For a moment, Max just stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room was still, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. But then, slowly, the sense of dread began to lift, the pressure easing, the room returning to normal. Max knew it wasn't over, not really. The echoes were still out there, lurking in the depths of the Ethernet, waiting for another chance to break through. But for now, at least, the door was closed. 6. The digital aftermath. The days that followed were a blur for Max. He disconnected entirely from the digital world, shutting off his devices, avoiding the internet, trying to distance himself from the horrors he had uncovered. But the memories lingered, haunting him in the quiet moments, when the house was dark and the silence pressed in around him. It wasn't until a week later that the detective arrived at Max's apartment. Detective Laura Kane was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a keen intuition. She had been assigned to Darren's case, following up on the strange circumstances surrounding his disappearance and the subsequent disturbances reported by those who had known him. Kane had a hunch that Max knew more than he was letting on, but when she knocked on his door, there was no answer. The apartment was dark, the windows shuttered, an unsettling stillness hanging in the air. She knocked again, louder this time, but still no response. Kane's instincts told her something was off, and she wasn't one to ignore her gut feelings. She radioed for backup, then carefully made her way around to the back of the building, where she found a window slightly ajar. With a practiced ease, Kane climbed through the window, landing softly in what appeared to be the living room. The air inside was stale, the faint scent of dust lingering in the air. "Max," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. There was no answer. Kane moved cautiously through the apartment, her senses on high alert. She passed through the kitchen, noting the cold coffee sitting on the counter, untouched. The hallway was dark, the light switches unresponsive when she tried them. It wasn't until she reached the basement door that she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The door was slightly ajar, a faint, almost imperceptible hum emanating from the darkness below. Kane drew her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as she descended the creaking stairs. The basement was cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones, and the hum grew louder as she reached the bottom step. And then she saw it. In the corner of the basement, tucked away behind a stack of old boxes, was the server. It was still on, the screen glowing faintly in the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the room. Kane approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something wrong about this, something deeply unsettling. She had seen a lot in her years on the force, but this was different. As she reached the server, the screen flickered, displaying lines of code that scrolled rapidly before her eyes. Kane squinted, trying to make sense of it. but the code was too complex, too alien. And then, for just a moment, the code stopped, and an image appeared on the screen. It was Max. His face was pale, his eyes wide and terrified, his mouth moving silently as if trying to speak. But his eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to stare into the very depths of Kane's soul. She stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. But before she could react, the screen went black. The hum ceased, and the basement was plunged into silence. Kane stood there, her mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. She knew she had to get out of there, to report this, to figure out what the hell was going on. But as she turned to leave, she heard it, the faint, distant sound of a whisper, echoing through the dark like a voice carried on the wind. Kane froze, her blood running cold. It was a voice she had heard before, Darren's voice, and it was saying just one word: help. Kane didn't waste another second. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest as she raced through the apartment and out the front door. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her like a shock of reality. She stood there, breathing heavily, her mind reeling. She knew she had stumbled onto something far beyond her understanding, something that shouldn't exist. But it did. And it was out there, waiting, watching, lurking in the shadows of the digital world. Kane knew she couldn't just walk away from this. She had to find out the truth, to figure out what had happened to Darren, to Max, and to so many others. But deep down, she knew one thing for sure. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some echoes are meant to be forgotten.